Well, hi, and welcome from COVID Central here as we are wrapping up the quarantine in the Buse household from Brenna's stay. I look forward to seeing you all again live and in person and in the flesh next Sunday. So we'll be able to get back to normal next Sunday, and next week I'll be in the offices down in Mattawa on Desert Air. So if you want to swing by and say hi, you sure can. I am not contagious. So no symptoms, felt fine, never caught it. We were just taking good precautions, and I think we were wise in what we did. But I'm excited about this week and continuing with our study in Matthew. Matthew is very interesting. Matthew chapter 5 opens up with the Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes, if you recall, are the beginning of Jesus' most famous sermon. And as a preacher, taking a look at somebody's sermon is kind of a technical nerdy thing that I like to do. And so we're going to take a look at Jesus' sermon as we get into the Sermon on the Mount, starting with the Beatitudes and what role or what place the Beatitudes play in the greater Sermon on the Mount and what role they play in our lives today. I was taught when I was a kid that the Beatitudes were attitudes to be emulated. That these were the be attitudes. This is how we were supposed to be. And the reality of that is, I recognize now as a grown-up that that's really not the case. It's not that gentleness is not a characteristic to emulate or virtue to emulate, or peacemaking or some of the ones that Jesus lists. It's that these Beatitudes came as a slap in the face, a wake-up call, a resounding gong that said, the value that you place on things religiously is upside down. It's wrong. The outsiders that will flock to Jesus, that will be drawn to him, are drawn to him particularly because of the fact that what he describes as the kingdom of heaven, where the least and less the least important and the most outcast of society could find a home, could find a place, could find love and forgiveness from their sins in a way that the religious system of his day just really was not able to do, because the religious system of the day dealt with the practice of sin, but it never dealt with the heart. And Jesus understood that to deal with our sin, we have to deal with our heart issues first. And he says to take on the heart of a child. And so with that heart of a child, I want us to read the Beatitudes, and to get you in the mood, I found these on the internet, and I thought this is very fitting. This is the heart of a child. Let's be thinking along these lines. These are letters to a pastor. Dear Pastor, I know God loves everybody, but he never met my sister. Yours sincerely, Arnold, age 8, Nashville. Dear Pastor, please say in your sermon that Peter Peterson has been a good boy all week. I am Peter Peterson. Sincerely, Pete, age 9, Phoenix. Dear Pastor, my father should be a minister. Every day he gives us a sermon about something. Robert Anderson, age 11. Dear Pastor, I'm sorry I can't leave more money in the plate, but my father didn't give me a raise in my allowance. Could you have a sermon about a raise in my allowance? Love, Patty, 10, New Haven. Dear Pastor, my mother is very religious. She goes to play bingo at church every week, even if she has a cold. Yours truly, Annette, age 9, Albany. Dear Pastor, I would like to go to heaven someday because I know my brother won't be there. Stephen, age 8, Chicago. Dear Pastor, I think a lot more people would come to your church if you moved it to Disneyland. Laureen, age 9, Tacoma. Dear Pastor, I liked your sermon where you said good health is more important than money, but I still want a raise in my allowance. Sincerely, Eleanor, age 12, Sarasota. Dear Pastor, I hope to go to heaven someday, but later than sooner. Love, Ellen, age 9, Athens. Dear Pastor, please say a prayer for our Little League team. We need God's help or a new pitcher. Thank you, Alexander, age 10, Raleigh. Dear Pastor, my father says I should learn the 10 Commandments, but I don't think I want to because we have enough rules already in my house. Joshua, age 10, South Pasadena. Dear Pastor, who does God pray to? Is there a God for God? Sincerely, Christopher 9, Titusville. Dear Pastor, are there any devils on earth? I think there may be one in my class, Carla, age 10, Selena. Dear Pastor, I liked your sermon on Sunday, especially when it was finished. Ralph, age 11, Akron. Dear Pastor, how does God know the good people from the bad people? Do you tell him, or does he read about it in the newspapers? Sincerely, Marie, age 9, Lewiston. So Jesus starts his entire sermon with the Beatitudes, and he says these things to shake people up, and we're going to go through each Beatitude, to shake them up in such a way that they will reestablish what God's economy is. Because they had built God's economy, built on the religious law and all the sacrifices and the temple and the rules of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And every group in Israel had kind of developed their own style. You had the Zealots that had decided that the only way to be completely holy was to be separate from people. And they lived out in the desert in communities, like where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. You had the Sadducees that tried to kind of play both sides and gave allegiance to Rome over their own Jewish roots. You had the Pharisees, who were the hyper nationalists, along with the Zealots, and they believed that if Israel would just follow the law, they would just follow the law, the Messiah would come and God would bring his salvation to us. I think it's safe to say that people didn't really understand what to look for when Jesus was coming. Even though they had the prophets, even though he fit the prophecies, what they were looking for was in 180 degrees the other direction. And so Jesus uses the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount to shake his disciples up so that they understand that the kingdom of heaven and what they're about is so far removed and so different than anything that they have experienced on earth so far. All right, let's dive right in. Starting in chapter 5, verse 1. It says, Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Okay, let's stop right there. Who are the poor in spirit? What does that mean to be poor in spirit? Well, in a society where wealth and esteem are kind of reflective of God's blessing on you, God's privilege that he's given to you, in that kind of world, the poor in spirit were those that were the desperate, the ones that had run out of options. They didn't fit into the system. They didn't fit into the religious system of the time, and they got ground underneath its gears. They were desperate. They were poor. They were ostracized. Matthew calls them the poor in spirit. They're those without hope in the current religious economy. But Jesus announces the kingdom is coming, and in fact has come, is here in him, in his coming, and they will find their place therein in the kingdom. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We hear this is in the psalmist as he cries out in Psalm 40, Yet I am poor and needy. May the Lord think of me. You are my help and my deliverer. Oh my God, do not delay. It's that spirit that that essence that Jesus is capturing in this first beatitude. And you can imagine the shock to the disciples. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the outcasts, the unwanted. Really, what kind of kingdom of heaven is this going to be after all? And I think they're in for a surprise. Jesus goes on and he says, Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. The arrival of the kingdom of heaven brings hope to those who mourn. It's the hope of restitution. It's the hope of things being made whole again. When we mourn because we've lost something, whether that's someone or something, maybe it's our health or it's our vitality or it's our heart. Sometimes we just lose track of our heart and we walk numb through life, and we need to rediscover our hearts. But we mourn over these lost things. In particular, Matthew's talking about those who mourn over their sin and depend on God for their absolution. There's a type of mourning where someone recognizes how desperate their situation is and that they have no hope. It's the mourning, it's the keening mourning, the keening wail of mourning that says there is no hope. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. The kingdom will come, and with the kingdom will come all of the things that have been promised, the justice and the reconciliation and the healing. No more tears, no more sadness. Joy comes on the eves of the kingdom. It's something for us because it applies to all our mourning, because our mourning is just about loss. And I don't say that to trivialize it, but to pinpoint what mourning really amounts to. It's that overwhelming sense of loss. Jesus' promise of comfort is found in filling that hole with Christ and knowing that we're not alone through it all. We have the now and future promise. We have the now promise that God is walking through it with us in our mourning, that God is present with us in our mourning. And we have the future promise that God will make all things new and will make all things right again. That our mourning is just for a season, not forever. What a hope that gives us. It also carries the promise that when the kingdom of heaven is fully realized on earth as it is in heaven, that our comfort will be complete and he will wipe away every tear, as Revelation tells us. Jesus goes on. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Somebody needs to let Jesus know that it's not the meek that get things. If you want something, you've got to be aggressive and go get it. That's the attitude of the world. That's the way the world works. The strong get what they want. Those who are aggressive take what they need. We have to speak up to have a voice to be heard. But the meek, the gentle, those who are willing to make do without so that you can have in your aggressive push through the line, they will inherit the earth. It's just not how it works. And yet, here's the strange promise that it will be the gentle, the meek, who will inherit the earth, not the powerful, not the strong, not the aggressive. That in God's economy, meekness is one of the greatest strengths. In God's economy, gentleness and peace are incredibly valuable. They're the things that people should be longing for, should be chasing after in God's economy, not so much in ours. I want to take a little bit of a rabbit trail here. I normally don't do that on purpose. Normally just do it on accident. But I think for us to understand this parable, or the Beatitudes and the parables that Jesus are going to tell about the kingdom of heaven, I think we need to understand some thoughts on heaven and reality and make sure that we're talking about the same thing. We won't understand the kingdom or how Jesus teaches us how to live in it until we get the takeaway that the invisible and the things of God's kingdom are the most real things in the universe. God's reality is the reality off which everything else is based. And in this reality, weakness is strength, and the long-suffering receive their reward. That's not what we often see with our eyes. But scriptures tell us that in God's viewpoint, in God's perspective of things, the one that really matters, where reality meets the road, those are the things that matter. We've been duped. We've been deceived by the great Satan himself. Has deceived us into thinking that this is how you get what you want. Be more aggressive, be louder than the next person. And if you're not sure what that looks like, just turn on your cable news show program and listen to the pundits talking as they shout over each other. And ask yourself if the meek are inheriting the earth right now. It seems impossible in this economy. It's like the movie The Matrix. Faith is like the pill that we take that allows us to look down the rabbit hole and into this reality that stands side by side to ours. Heaven is not some faraway place way up in the stratosphere somewhere in the galaxy that God just hangs out. The Bible portrays heaven as kind of an alternate reality that's side by side to ours, where the kingdom of heaven, where the kingdom of God, where the reality of God is present and intertwined, and that's connected to our reality. God can act and move in our reality. And he does act and move in our reality. But heaven is not some far off place. Heaven is just kind of one step over. And if you get into the whole science fiction and alternate universes and things like that, this may be a little easier to understand or grasp. But the idea was that heaven was ever present. We were just out of tune with it, out of sync with it. I remember a friend of mine told me when his dad had died, he had actually died and was resuscitated, that after his dad had come back from the dead and was resuscitated, that he had difficulty sitting down in things like chairs. He would sit down very gently, very tenderly, and that he didn't fully trust his weight in a chair. And when they asked him about it, the only explanation that he could give was that after his experience and seeing the things that he saw while he was dead, that this stuff didn't seem nearly as solid as the things on the other side. It didn't seem as real as the things that he saw on the other side. And he had a hard time trusting in things like chairs to hold his weight again. And I always was struck by that and the reality of that heaven is the reality and earth is our poor shadow copy of it. All right, let's keep going. That's enough for you to get it. That's the rabbit trail. Jesus comes to reveal the kingdom of heaven and how to enter it, how to get into it. He said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." Have you ever been denied justice? I know that sounds like a 30-second ad for an injury lawyer commercial on TV, but hear me out. Have you ever been denied justice? Have you ever known a passion and zeal for things to be made right, to be fixed? That's what Jesus is talking about here. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Do you remember William Wilberforce? Or do you know of William Wilberforce? William Wilberforce was the great British parliamentarian who was an abolitionist. He became a member of parliament at age 21 and was a fast-rising star in parliament until the issue of slavery came up. Because of his conversion, he had decided to not be a party man and just vote down party lines, but that he would vote his conscience on everything. And so he was often sought out by both sides of the aisle as an independent, as someone to sign on to their different legislations. He became an abolitionist and for over 20 years fought for the abolition of slavery in England, and ultimately died right before the Anti-Slavery Act was passed in England. But he got to see the seeds planted, and he knew the fruit of his work was worth it. Retired in his ill health to basically being penniless, and died out his days that way. But he was so touched, so moved by the needs of the slaves that it became his all-encompassing passion, and he died shortly before the Slavery Act could become law. But I will tell you right now that man has been filled. He was absolutely filled with a hunger and thirst for righteousness. He saw something that was inhuman and broken and wanted to make it right. And so despite it being the unpopular thing for so many years, he fought on for abolition and against slavery and squandered all of his good health and all of the political capital that he had raised in his time as an MP. He pushed it all in on this one central issue, because for him it became the one thing that dominated his life. This search, this hunger for righteousness. Now, we don't all have to be William Wilberforces, but there has to be in us that desire for things to be made right, for things to be whole, for things to be the way God wants them to be. Jesus promises us that if that is our hunger, that we will be filled. We will not go away empty, hungry, looking for righteousness, but walking away deluded, walking away frustrated and hungry and empty-handed. He says, no, if you come to the kingdom of God, if you come to the kingdom of heaven, as Matthew calls it, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, you will be filled. Your hunger will be sated. He was blessed because he longed for righteousness, for things to be made right. We can go on. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. So this is the part of God's economy to me that's really interesting. Basically, that you will be shown mercy in as much as you show mercy to others. Now, this is not a hard and fast black and white rule, but this is something that has come predominantly, that's talked about throughout the Old New Testament in particular. Jesus talks about it. Paul talks about it. Several Christian writers talk about it in their writings and letters in the New Testament. And it was something familiar to the early Christians. I'm not sure we really understand what it means now. It doesn't mean that if I'm not perfect in my mercy for others, that I'm going to burn in hell. or I'll be separated from God forever and ever and ever. But what it does tell us is that how we respond to the mercy of God is absolutely critical, because how we respond to God's mercy and how we show that to other people will dictate, will be that filter through which the mercy of God flows into us. If we are people who do not like mercy, we will not experience God's mercy in the fullness and the way that He wants to show it to us. If you really want to experience God's mercy, you have to be a merciful person. It's just the way it works. It's hard to not extend mercy when mercy has been repeatedly extended to you. This is a condemnation of the religious leaders and all who thought that they didn't need God's mercy because they had figured out the system. Their pride made them look down their noses at others who were less than and justify their lack of mercy with their messed up theology. Kingdom dwellers are aware that they are citizens by grace only, and that should translate to how we view and act towards others, shouldn't it? Kingdom dwellers are well aware that they are citizens by grace only, and that should translate to how we view and act towards others. I believe it should. A defendant was on trial for murder, and there was strong evidence indicating guilt, but there was no corpse. In the defense's closing statement, the lawyer, knowing that his client would probably be convicted, resorted to a trick. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I have a surprise for you all," the lawyer said as he looked at his watch. "Within 1 minute, the person presumed dead in this case will walk into this courtroom." He looked toward the courtroom door. The jurors, somewhat stunned, all looked on eagerly. A minute passed. Nothing happened. Finally, the lawyer said, "Actually, I made up the previous statement, but you all looked on with anticipation. I therefore put to you that you have a reasonable doubt in this case as to whether anyone was killed, and I insist that you return a verdict of not guilty." The jury, clearly confused, retired to deliberate. A few minutes later, the jury returned and pronounced a verdict of guilty. "But how?" inquired the lawyer. "You must have had some doubt. I saw all of you stare at the door." The jury foreman replied, "Oh, we all did look all right, but the trouble is, your client didn't." Oh, that we would be known as people that are full of mercy. That we would expect mercy to come bursting through the doors at any second. That we would show that kind of quick mercy to people, not as an act of weakness or enabling, but an act of mercy when people are truly at their lowest point, when they're truly broken. To be that tender mercy for them is a blessing from God, and it's what we're called to be. Jesus goes on, he says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Well, that's kind of an interesting criteria or title. Who are the pure in heart? What's he mean by that? The pure in heart are those who seek after God with all their heart. It's the beginning of the Shema, the most important commandment in the Bible. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, the pure in heart are those who seek after God with all their heart. Purity was always thought of in Jewish religion as an exterior thing. There were purification rituals and things that you went through if you were impure to make yourself pure, to be connected again with God, to be connected with worship, to be connected with other people again. And here is Jesus turning purity on its head again, just like these other concepts. It's not all this outside stuff that you try to do to make you pure. It's your heart that is pure. Purify your heart by seeking after God with everything. That's the cry of Jesus. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are the peacemakers. Israel had lived under occupation, and all of their factions that they had built up under the occupation of these various foreign rulers, from the Greeks to the Romans, didn't do anything to give them freedom. It just made them more divisive. It just made things harder. And when the real Messiah came, they weren't looking because they were so caught up in their factions and their rivalries with one another. N.T. Wright, the great Bible scholar, says, with a certain oversimplification, we can trace easily enough the three options open to Jews in Jesus' day. First, the quietest and ultimately dualist option, taken on by the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, Separate yourselves from the wicked world and wait for God to do whatever God is going to do. Second, the compromise option taken by Herod. Build yourself fortresses and palaces. Get along with your political bosses as well as you can. Do as well out of it as you can and hope that God will validate it somehow. Third, the zealot option. That of the Sicarii, who took over Herod's old palace fortress of Masada during the Roman-Jewish War. Say your prayers, sharpen your swords, make yourselves holy to fight a holy war, and God will give you a military victory that will also be the theological victory of good over evil, of God over the hordes of darkness, of the Son of Man over the monsters. Only when we put Jesus into this context do we realize how striking, how dramatic was his own vocation and agenda. He was neither a quietist, nor a compromiser, nor a zealot. No, Jesus provides a fourth option for the Jews. He provides them the kingdom of heaven. Jesus shows us the radical power to change through peace in his own life and with his death and resurrection. Despite all the power that he had to be able to strike down anyone who stood against him, Jesus accepted his suffering and accepted his fate because he knew that through this, his children and the children of God would be bought, the kingdom would be brought into fullness through the cross. And many would come for thousands of years into this kingdom. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Again, the Beatitudes are not attitudes to replicate. Jesus is comforting people who've already undergone persecution for righteousness. They're already struggling to make peace. They're already trying to be pure of heart. That's the people the kingdom was made for. These are not attitudes to replicate. He reminds them that while they are persecuted here, it only reinforces the fact that they belong in the kingdom of heaven. Because the kingdom of heaven draws persecuted people like a flame draws a moth. Matthew's going to continue in this chapter reminding the disciples that Israel was called to be salt and light to the world. And that is what he is calling them to be, light in the darkness, a bit of flavor in a bland world. And that's what Jesus is calling his disciples and ultimately calling us to be. The Beatitudes are that wake-up call to us that says that God's economy is different than ours, that the things that matter to God, that really matter to God, are the things that should really matter to us, and that if we lived that way, our lives would be transformed by it. It's an incredible challenge. My wife has challenged me, and I've taken the challenge this new year to do a Whole30 diet to see if that helps with some of my health issues and just to see if that changes, how I feel based on how I eat. And I'm excited about it, excited for the challenge and for the change. But I have to look at eating and everything about it totally different. And I think that's what's going on here. I think the Beatitudes is God's way of saying to his disciples, everything you've learned up to this point is wrong. Let's start fresh. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the poor. You get the idea. Have a wonderful Sunday. God bless you. I love you. And go Hawks.